This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and it's December the 6th. And I wanted to say a few things about mowing. At this time of the year, a lot of the roads get mown. And you have to thank the Department of Transportation for doing that. One of the problems is that, especially north-south corridors, if you have a little piece of vegetation or something that can be a nucleus, then you're going to accumulate a little bit of snow, a little bit of ice, and very shortly you have a nucleus, and the wind's blowing basically west to east, and very shortly you got a buildup of snow, and then you got a drift onto the road. So you'll notice that right now most roads are mown fairly heavily, quite heavily for some people who are not used to this sort of stuff. It is rather deleterious to people who are eliminating seed or collecting seed. The elimination process is that if you have a whole bunch of noxious weeds that you're trying to prevent from seeding, then this knocks the seed heads and drops the seed, and you really have a mess. It's if you go just north of Rantoul, happen to be going there, you'll see that there is was going to be a dual highway, and 57 went in instead. So the one road was a modern Route 45 north, and the land that was bought for the second leg was converted into natural history. There was ash trees were planted, and cypress, and it was basically just opposite our Pope Prairie. There's been a lot of tree vegetation. There's also you're going up over the Bloomington Moraine, so you have a cutting through the moraine as you go north. So you not only have the retired or the never used, never developed road, but you also have cuttings, and that's not an easy place for mowing. It's very easy to turn a tractor over on that sort of place. So you need either a slope that's reasonably gentle, or you need to sit on top of that ground or on the roadside with a high-ho contraption with a mower at the end of the high-ho, so that you can move it and move it into untoward places. Well, so it's not an easy place to mow, and sometimes it's on different sides of the road. But this Kirby was going up there and was kind of surprised because she's been removing teasel, which is a really noxious weed, and the aim why she was going there was to knock back some of those weeds to collect the seed head so that they don't spread the seed. And it's a little surprising to find that it has been already mown, which reminds us to remind people who are in this situation that they really have to put their mission together early. Some of it you have to put together before August the 1st, because that was a time when uh, initial mowing goes on. If you have some uh, docket or status with the state, that might be postponed. It's really quite difficult because things like New England aster and Asia aster are still blooming. The frost asters are still blooming, even if the temperature goes down below freezing. Uh, it's, so there's still habitat there, and there's a slight conflict between mowing and preservation on the roadside. Uh, you can uh, watch what's going on, uh, precede it, and talk to the mowing people, or you have a variance created so that it's known. Along with the variance, you need to put a notice on your site that if you don't want it mown, uh, then people know. And on roadsides, and especially on railroad lines, it's very hard to put those signs in because there's a lot of gravel, and you really need a power piece of equipment to put in a decent sign. And the sign in the first place probably costs you $200, uh, depending on what it is. We don't have that sort of money, so that we go along with the equivalent of uh, political signs and just say, natural area, please don't mow. Uh, one year we were adjacent to this site at Rantoul, and we had a few leftover uh, teasel on it. And uh, there's a tendency for the mowing people, if there's vacant space alongside the uh, area that's owned by the Department of Transportation, they will spill over and volunteer mow uh, ugly looking places. So uh, sometimes a prairie looks like an ugly looking place, especially if it has some teasel on it. So they have equipment that is equivalent to what you see using herbicides on cornfields and soybeans to spread herbicide. And so very shortly we had an herbicide machine herbiciding the prairie. We were kind of lucky because teasel is a weed. Weeds tend to do well on uh, soils that are fertile and uh, 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 fertilized, and uh, they they have been nicely worked. Well, a small portion of our prairie was made in an attempt to grow crops on glacial till. Wasn't very successful. It only lasted, I think, one season, but it uh, the luck was that the teasel was on the disturbed area, so we did uh, make a record of this. We didn't have a helicopter or uh, a flying object in the sky to take a picture of this, but for 3 years at least, you could see where the herbicide machine had been. It took out all the. We have planted that area, so uh, there needs to be a communication between the mowing teams and the people who are trying to preserve. And in fairness to the mowing teams, you really need to put in signs. Sometimes it is thought that we move the signs out closer to the roadside. We don't do that. The signs that are there that say uh, natural history preservation site are usually there by docket with the Department of Transportation. And if you go to past maintenance dockets or to plans where the road was modified, the signs where they were put. Uh, so we're pretty lucky with the prairie itself. It's got very little teasel on it, even though it is adjacent to teasel areas. Uh, the acreage that was between us and the cemetery is on set aside. So the way of getting uh, weed crop there down is to do uh, cultivation. So with the site below our area has been cultivated recently. I called Mr. Akers to say that if he hadn't sold it, and that's so. So if we get the chance, we will do a kickstart on that and buy that piece of land for our interest. But the no-till cultivation uh, controls the weeds. If you have a cover crop on it, it also helps to bury the cover crop so that it will rot, and if it's a legume especially, it'll provide some fertilizer for the future. For us, it does make some cultivation or disturbance of the soil, so you are likely to get more teasel. And believe me, between Rantoul and Maplewood Cemetery, it is live with teasel. It hasn't been attended to a lot. There is a swampland. It's a rather wonderful swampland. Its edges are uh, live with teasel, uh, but they don't go out into the water. They're not water-loving plants. So that acreage is around the periphery is loaded with this fairly invasive uh, weed. It's there because it's a rather elegant plant. It's used by horticulturists and florists in dried arrangements, and it goes into wreaths, which end up in the cemetery. And that's probably been the source for most of the teasel around. But teasel has been moving around the state to the point that the state has a teasel detail. It's a 5-ton truck with herbicide on it, and one of these uh, herbicide machines that go into the field that also go onto the roadside. So it comes periodically, and there's a lot of concern about the dominance of teasel. We even have it on South 45. Uh, there are other ways of dealing with it. We deal with it. It's a little awkward for us. We spot herbicide. And you have to know that with ecosystems like humans and human brains, uh, you don't have to have much of a chemical to make quite a difference. So you have to be rather respectful of the uh, plants that you have uh, preserved, or you perhaps have uh, planted by seed. So Ron Sleater comes from Decatur, and he has spot oversighted very carefully a lot of this area, so we don't have a teasel problem. There was an era when you removed seed by mechanical means. Often that meant that the farm child or children, and in the Victorian era, about the turn of the century, uh, say 1890 and 1910, that sort of era, uh, children walked the beans fields and the cornfields looking for one weed which was particularly invasive, which was milkweed. Uh, Strangely, now that has become very popular because it's also a site for developing uh, caterpillars for the likes of monarchs. Monarchs aren't the only butterflies around, but they have status. So now, when someone that's elderly is looking at a bean field and it has a few milkweeds in it, they remember back to when they had to eliminate those milkweeds. Now they're being encouraged. Actually, you can, at certain events, you will be able to buy or be given milkweed plants so that you can encourage your own backyard or your field, uh, and uh, increase habitat for not only the monarch but other species. Uh, so there are other forms of mechanical uh, working of fields. One of them is to scuffle. A scuffler is an instrument. It used to be drawn by a horse. If it's a one row scuffler, and that was an important tool where you had uh, levees and just a little patch of corn. Uh, the horse would draw it. The horse would be between the rows of corn, and the horse was very well trained to do this. It could get to the end and it would know to turn and come down the next row. The scuffler was like uh, probably about 15 little trowels, and it would disturb the soil. And if it's summer and it's dry, the weeds would expire. Uh, you could, if you had a wider row, you could expand those scuffler elements uh, to fill the whole track. That's one way of doing it. It's a lot of work. So very shortly, you had a machinery that could do 6, 8, or many rows at once. Uh, that has been basically replaced by herbicide, which is convenient in many ways. You don't have to be there with a scuffler and doing it several times a year. Uh, there are other situations where you can mound the soil. Corn, for instance, has uh, prop roots, and it doesn't hurt to take some of that soil between the row and put it up on the roots of the corn plant. You do it like extremely in asparagus. If you want bleached white asparagus, then you cultivate with soil and put soil up around the shoots that are coming up, and that blanches them. But it's also a method of weed control. Uh, Another fine method is to burn. So at Lake Park, just recently, uh, the prairie was burned, and I was interested to see that the people who burned it uh, got into the weedy areas, and often burning is a control mechanism. You also have to know that you need to apply your mechanical means, your herbicide means, or your firing at the appropriate time, which means it pays you to have gone to agronomy or somewhere or to a book and uh, fished out information about when this particular uh, weed will be prevalent and what is its lifestyle. The talent is to find the weed which is the dominant weed uh, that you're dealing with and know when it's at a milk stage in its development. That means you take the seed and you break it open with your uh, thumbnails and see that it is soft. It's not yet good enough to be viable and grow, but it's a very good time to remove that weed. Uh, so if you do your burning at that time, that helps. Burning doesn't always happen at that time because burning might be more convenient for you to do during the winter. But burning can also be used as a uh, method of control. We do have uh, plants that are kind of poisonous, and uh, they tend to be along roadsides. One of them is hemlock, and we have to warn people. There's a tendency to take out hemlocks with a machete, but if you do that, it will leak uh, juice, and that juice is poisonous. Uh, it's not concentrated down so that it will kill you, but it will give you dermatitis. So it pays when you take that plant to have gloves on. So you uh, pick it up in the middle of its stem. So all the stems are at one end and all the leakage is at one end, and you avoid it. Uh, so poisons can be of concern. I'm reminded that if you go to the vet school, you'll find a little garden of poison plants. This is because people need to know what time of year to exterminate them, what is the active ingredient, when is the active ingredient active. It might be in spring, it might be in the forest, it might be in wet places or on roadsides. So that uh, plot of land was associated with a book written by Dr. Evers, who was the herbarium specialist for the Natural History Survey, working with a professor named Link in the veterinary school to figure out uh, what are the poison plants and what their lifestyles. So there continues to be staff in the veterinary school that looks at this sort of thing. It can be more serious than you think because it one the ingredient might be quite harmless, but it might be flavoring your milk. If you have carrot weed, then you're going to have carrot flavored milk. Uh, it might be that this weed is in clumps, so you may want to put a fence around it uh, as you work on it to get rid of it. It it's often along railroad lines. It's often along roadsides. Hemlock is a major one. Poison ivy is another kind of a nuisance, and it can be very, very allergenic if you're working with it. Even the fumes from uh, poison ivy can be harmful. Some animals can, and including humans, can eat poison ivy, but it's a cumulative poison, and you just have to be careful. Uh, you have to know where it grows. It often grows where there's a little bit of edge timber, where it has a something to crawl up. Uh, you often will see a telephone pole with poison ivy growing up it, or a fence post, uh, and it's very inconvenient, especially for people who don't know anything about 3 leaves and let it be. 3 leaves, and you can see the ruckus of those leaves, and it pays you to leave it alone. If you're young, it will not affect you as much because it's a cumulative poison, and it'll get to the point where you get to be older, and it will affect you. So uh, there are other weeds that are less obvious, but they're subtle. They may affect animals that are grazing and affect their mouth parts. Uh, some of them are loco weeds. They get to your brain, and so the animal will start to behave differently, and that's a good indication that you have a problem. Uh, and it's fairly obvious that when you have that sort of problem, you have a clump of the same plants, or it's not just something that's spread loosely across a pasture. So it's fairly easy to identify and get rid of or surround it. And uh, the Dr. Evers and Dr. Link that I was talking about have written a book, and it's let me see where it is here. Uh, Here we are. It's Poison Plants of the Midwest. It's interesting that they were trying to display it so that you could find the plant or the weed that you're working with. Uh, and one of the early moves to do that was to take photographs of your weed with a black background behind them. So uh, this has used that sort of technique. Uh, Color photographs were coming in at the time that this book was prepared by the Natural History Survey, and it's got some of those photographs at the rear end. In early days of uh, uh, color photography, it was not easy to do a color printing throughout your text. So you would either have middle pages or end pages that would have color uh, display. And behind each of these plants, there is the early interpretation or attempt to interpret by using a black drop. That sort of technique has dropped off. It's actually it's gone toward uh, sketching, and biologists uh, either do it themselves or they have specialists who take that plant and work with it. Uh, People like Dr. Evers would have specimens in a herbarium, and uh, but you also it's nice to have live specimens and know how to maintain them. Uh, Sometimes you're talking about roots as well as stems as well as leaves, and so you need to include that portion of the plant that is viable. There's a thing that I call dieberry. It's I forget what it's called here. Uh, it's a uh, a berry that is poisonous, but that plant has also tubers, and people can eat those tubers. They know how to treat them and to boil them in water. Uh, so uh, you do need to consult with all the parts of the plant and the st- hairs or whatever uh, are important for you to know about. Uh, some of these are plants that you would respect, like uh, Jack in the Pulpit or uh, Dutchman's breeches. Some of these are forest plants. So if you are uh, routinely moving your cattle to different sites and they get a problem in the forest, and you know that this is a forest plant and you have to do something different to get rid of it, or just not put uh, your animals there for grazing intermittently. Yeah. So I assume that this uh, publication got uh, funding probably from a federal level to uh, put in a garden of poisonous plants. And uh, if you want to see that little garden, it's uh, you go along, uh, go east on St. Mary's Road till you almost to Lincoln Avenue, and you'll see a little turn in there, and some odd plants that you wouldn't expect to see cultivated as ornamentals. Not too far from where the university uh, horticulture people have plants very near the presidential house. I have been saying things about interpretation, but I'm going through books at the present time, and I hope to do something more about this. There are various levels that you need to look at. One is how you organize your story, uh, and uh, it might be that you don't have a lot of time, so and you're going to pass on or whatever. So you put together what you can. The archivists are grateful for you to do that because you probably have a story that might be unique. Uh, Even if it's not unique, it gives people an idea of what it was like at this time and in this place. Uh, sometimes those books are specialists. There are people who have English language and literature as their background. They're university people, or they're specialists who have specialized, and we've been talking about uh, canals, and so they have lived and uh, with a canal and recorded it, and their parents and grandparents have done the same. Uh, there are people who we revere. In Champaign County, there was a Cunningham family, and uh, I think it was J.O. Cunningham was revered for uh, the work that he did recording early Champagne history. People like uh, Daniel McCollum, who's been mayor of Champagne, uh, followed that and utilized those sorts of books to give us a more applied and more modern version of same. But I pick up little pamphlets or uh, memorabilia that I think uh, should be preserved. It is kind to those who might read it in the future, when 20 years' time, when you might not be here, to record them in some sort of order. Not all of us are very well organized, but we uh, would hope to leave something that is readable and understandable, sometimes fun, and uh, yes. So I want to encourage you to do this, and uh, then you can be dependent on people who uh, know the modern technology of how to put that information into action. It used to be that most of your photographs would be in black and white. Now it is cheaper to do color than it is to do black and white. The black and white people are specialists. So you need the people who have that sort of skill that can look at the page and say, yes, we know this is the order, but we'll put it in context where you might put uh, some little connotation around a page number, or we'll have a responsibility for putting on a frontispiece, a design, so that we do have a designers around. Just this last day, I had a call from Joel McDonald, and he's wanting to have a logo that he can put on his landscape trucks, and therein lies some talent. You need to have a sign that you can see from a distance, so it has to be bold. It probably has to be one color, because if you're going to put it on a uh, something to stick on your vehicle, one color is easier to work with and simpler to see. So at the moment, I've been asked to look at the early elements of this sort of thing to see if it can't uh, give the public something to see that's worthwhile. It takes time, but it is worth it. So one of these days we'll get together with various people like this. Uh, I've been looking at a Harriet book. Uh, Harriet was in England, uh, a veterinarian in the York area, and uh, he eventually wrote 3 books uh, about his practice and the landscape itself in wintertime or summertime. or in a workplace, or uh, where he was married or where they worked, what are the streams. And this man is very famous for doing that, and there's been television series and the like. So we aren't all going to be able to do that, but it's really nice to see what you thought when you looked over a landscape and saw its trees and its fields. Y- If you're in a plane and you look down, you see the cornfields and the bean fields of East Central Illinois, and that can be interesting in its own manner. You can see where the creeks go. You can see where you would have had a uh, contoured landscape. But early on, Jefferson decided that it was easier to put squares across the country. So people who were proselytized to buy the land in Europe in speculation would know how to find it. If you're following contours, contours will change their place. If you have a flood, the river might be in a different location. So the plot of land you bought might be on one side or the other. But if you uh, are dealing with a straight uh, rectilinear north, south, east, and west, you could find it. I was interested the other day to go to a shop on South First Street. It's a Flatiron building, and uh, it's on the limits of two plats. Uh, if you go down First Street from University Avenue, you'll see it uh, one street down. It's about 100 yards down from University Avenue. And First Street is on the Jeffersonian plat, and University Avenue is on the Jeffersonian plat. But this building has a door, and the front end is probably not much wider than the door. So you have to go in, and I was looking for some plastic for a shield, and I met with a gentleman who is in charge, and he knows very well that this is a building that has a flatiron shape because it is on the railroad plat. The railroad went through at a diagonal, and it created these flatiron buildings. And so his building, as it goes further towards Logan Street, gets wider and wide enough to be an industrial place where he works and sells plastic. But he knows very well where the history comes from. He's uh, got uh, the records. The records are often very awkward because this might have been land that was owned by Busey family very early on and sold. So you had to have deeds. This was land that was selling in the early 1800s. It might have been later than that. Uh, and then the buildings went up. And sometimes the railroads came in at an angle too. So that created a different shape of building. Actually, if you stand on the railroad line and look towards the city building, you'll notice that the city building is on one of these flatiron shapes. Uh, so therein lies a small story that could be available. It is probably in a safe box somewhere, and it may not be easy to copy because early paper was made with acid and alkali, and uh, it breaks down over the years. So if you go to a document from 1860, you might have to work with it very carefully. In that case, it's better to take a photograph of it and leave the original together as much as you can, so that the public, which wants to perhaps use the concept of whether this was Busey family or who developed the, the plat, or uh, and what the history was of the railroad being given land to put together the railroad band to put together towns like Champaign. Uh, so just that little story is hidden, but it needs people uh, to ask those questions and to exhibit some interest to inspire uh, a little bit of further action so that the public might share in that information. Right nearby, we have a detention pond, so people are using it a lot, and it wouldn't hurt to have a little sign here somewhere or a recognition of the building as a historic building, and hope that it doesn't get destroyed for development at a later date. That's something that worries us a lot. Uh, about 2 years ago, we lost a wooden elevator outside of Alton. I really have not gotten over that yet, because it was either by design or by uh, neglect. We didn't have control of the building at the time. And to lose it, you lose 17-inch beams. You lose the little elevator, that one-person elevator, which would take you up to the area where you could move uh, grain around into different bins. If you didn't do that, then the elevator was unstable enough that it could fall over. Uh, so you had to be up in the clouds, and sometimes you had to be up on the roof if the roof needed repair. Uh, that was There's a story there. I talked to some people at Thomasboro who had the opportunity to save an elevator but decided not to, and but they had a story about uh, going up on the roof. The roof manhole cover had moved, and they had to get the manhole cover back on the position where it was supposed to be. But there was a story, and the children were adult children, were actually interested in that story, whereas father was not quite so interested. The era for him has been Fisher Grain and Coal Company. It had a weighbridge, uh, but there was land underneath, so it could be corn and soybeans. And sometimes the older generation has been more used to being able to utilize resources without necessarily wondering what will happen in the future. But our younger population of people is getting to the point where they're asking questions about what will be left for them. We worry about that with Prairie and getting down to 0.01% that's left. And then you have to think about how you organize people in multiple generations. How do you get people together to do regional planning, which if you have people who are fairly independent, they're going to be reluctant to be told what to do by a regional planning commission. We do have a Champaign County Regional Planning Office, but we don't have an East Central Illinois Regional Planning Office. It's a sort of place where you have to get people together. And sometimes they do get together. If you have a landfill on top of the Muhammad Aquifer and 80,000 people drink water from it, or from the aquifer, then you do get a rising of those people, those 14 or 15 towns that are taking water from that aquifer will get together. Unfortunately, it doesn't always last very long. You have the problem, it's somewhat solved. You have the state and the federal government involved, and that's the uh, end of the problem. But more subtly, we need regional planning in action at the moment. We're having a rail trail come through from Bloomington towards Champaign. It's coming as far as Farmer City and uh, Mansfield. Yet there's no one in our region realizing that there's some elements of that corridor that are very good prairie, and they're not. Uh, they don't have an advocate that is ready to uh, stand on top of that prairie and talk to people. And it can get to blows. It's not an easy thing to suggest to people who want to have a recreational trailer is very wide and takes out the prairie. And you want to say, excuse me, but your prairie is down to next to nothing. Can you please have a narrower trail? We need that sort of regional planning from Bloomington into Mansfield. We also need it on the Kickapoo Trail between St. Joe uh, and Atwood, not Atwood, Oakwood, where the trail could be a little narrower. And it's not just me saying this, there are other people too. We're got so little prairie and prairie soil left that it is really a challenge to talk to recreators and say, excuse us, but there's some preservation that we should do here. So having you out there looking at stories, listening to what Grandpa says, uh, looking at an old barn, looking at a drainage ditch, finding creatures that are coming into town. It's a lot of birds and wildlife is coming into town because that's the only place where there's any habitat left. So it's getting to be time, and I've been uh, wanting to not go over. So this is programming that is on WEFT and facilitated by the Urbana Public Television. And we appreciate very much both those agencies that have been around for a long time.